Some would say that the standard of government in the Western world, in the developed world, is a high standard, the best standard possible that we could get, despite all its faults, and that the rest of the world should aspire to that. What's your view of that?
Well, it is certainly true that there are many governments that don't have rule of law, and where the rulers are authoritarian, totalitarian, they enslave, oppress, control their citizens. But to suggest that Western governments are the acme of political perfection is going too far. We have a long way to go before we live in a society where we can say we are responsibly governed and where we can say there is proper and effective public participation.
Okay, thank you. Social life now tends to be dominated by two key issues: the economic crisis and the attacks that we've seen to freedom and transparency. On the other hand, these have been issues for many years, have always been problems of the last say 50 years anyway. Is there a particular point in time now when we need to be especially concerned about these issues?
Well, I would say for thousands of years, probably since humanity came out of the caves and formed societies, that there have been economic problems and problems of personal freedom and security. I think, however, it's reasonable to say that we've reached a state now of financial ruin, financial disaster, economic disaster, and infringement on personal liberty that is at some sort of peak. We have all the Western governments insolvent. We have all the major banking systems of the world insolvent. Nothing like that has ever happened before. In terms of the transfer of wealth from the poor or middle classes to the wealthy and ultra wealthy, far exceeds anything that's ever occurred in the past. From a liberty point of view, there have never been as many laws and regulations in existence as there are now. The size of government bureaucracies, essentially unaccountable bureaucracies, faceless bureaucrats, has grown and exploded. The number of agencies is more than ever in the past. The amount and power of central control, the invasion and the knowledge of all our communications and movements, nothing like this has ever happened before. So I think it's reasonable to say that we're at a peak in some way. I'm not saying it won't get worse, but it's never been quite like this.
And so there are many like you, I think, aren't there, now feel that change is desperately needed, but they fear turmoil, there may be demagoguery re-established. Is there a real way forward?
Well, I can understand people are frightened and concerned. The part of these concerns comes from this notion is that we have the best that there is. And therefore the only alternative, if the best that there is has created such a mess, we're going to go back to something more primitive. But I think that's not the correct view. I think societies should be viewed as if they have a path of maturation. People become more responsible, more intelligent, and governments become more capable. Once you think that there could be a future which is in some way more sophisticated than the present, these worries, I think, will recede, and the concern will be how to bring about that future. And that future can be encapsulated in a very simple way. The people have to be responsible for their politicians and their politics.
But isn't this the crux of the problem? That in fact, what we've seen recently certainly has been, despite these crises, terrible crises financially, for example, the public has simply sat back and accepted these things. Why do you think, why is the time right then now for this radical change that you seem to be proposing?
Well, I think that at the moment there isn't a conception of what can happen. But what those who are concerned about the future should keep in mind is that the public we have now is not the public of 500 years ago, when they were all serfs, 100 years ago, when they were all dependent and uneducated, or even 30 years ago. What we now have is a public with a high level of education. We have a public that have powers in relationship to getting information of all sorts, which was never available to them before. We have the internet revolution. We have capacities to communicate, share thoughts and ideas, develop possibilities that simply did not exist in the past. Not only that, I believe that there's an increased psychological sophistication because of the revolution in consciousness and awareness that's occurred. People are aware that they are unique individuals, that others think differently to themselves. People do not accept paternalism from governments that just trust them and they know best. People feel more responsible. They reject being infantilized. So I think the public is different, and if that's so, then they are ready to take responsibility.
So you're basically proposing radical political change and reform. Are you advocating revolution?
Well, it's radical because the idea that the people are willing and able to be responsible for their politicians is barely imaginable. It's revolutionary in the sense of being new, just like we speak of the internet revolution. It's certainly, we're not talking about storming the barricades or burning town halls or executing the rulers. Not at all.
And would you say, for example, movements like Occupy, are they relevant to these changes that you're envisaging?
Occupy, to me, represents, it's natural, it's expression of concern, but it represents the past. It doesn't really provide the solution that we need. Where you have totalitarian governments and uneducated population, then you have to have the use of force and you end up having violence. In a sophisticated society, it's counterproductive. Like any crowd, protest movements, they're not really rational. They're vulnerable actually to demagogues. They do not really tap into the strengths and capabilities of the population or the increasing sophistication of individual citizens. And more seriously, governments dismiss them, they suppress them, they use them as excuses for increased control, and they tend to persecute the leaders. So it's understandable, but it's not the way forward.
There seems to be a lot of dissatisfaction and disconnection from politics. We know recent polls have shown that the main problem that the public have with politicians is the broken promises and basic discontent with the system. How can this be altered?
Well, I think it's important to recognise that our politicians are many of them among the best and the brightest in society. They're often decent people, but they're entering a system of power. They have the responsibility to use power, but they end up in a system where the abuse of power is more noticeable and more prevalent than its use. I think if we regard politicians as professionals, so just think of other groups that have power over us, like doctors or lawyers or priests. We expect professionalism of them. We could expect politicians to be professional. That means they wouldn't deceive for personal ends. They wouldn't engage in dishonest financial activities. They wouldn't invade privacy inappropriately. They wouldn't get involved in cronyism or bribery, or they wouldn't gag the press. This is all issues, as I would see, of professional behaviour. Doing all these things does not actually deal with society's problems. By and large, it tends to aggravate them. So if we see there's no need for our dysfunctional political system, if we can see that it can stop any time, which is really the hardest thing to accept, that it could actually be stopped tomorrow, the public could insist on a professional political system. I mean, in the West, you can't insist on it in a totalitarian society. But the public have to make that effort to keep the politicians honest.
So what is your strategy then?
Well, there are two key features. The first is we have to move away from issues, right? Issues divide people. Right? What we're concerned about here is context. We're concerned with the standards, the norms, the general way that politics is conducted. We want to somehow reduce the level of deception, the level of distrust of politicians, of the public, the degree of theft and economic waste that government generates, the reduction of oppression. We want to get politicians to behave more professionally generally, not engage in smear campaigns that push nothing forward. So we're not focusing on issues here, we're focusing on context. Mm-hmm. Now that is a new notion.
Yes.
The second thing is that we have to have public regulation, public responsibility. The public has to decide whether or not the political system is being abused or misused, not the politicians or the politicians' appointees. So these are the two crucial features.
And how do the public do this?
Well, the first thing is they can't do this through protests or massing in the street. This requires thought, it requires organisation, and in my view, we can mobilise the public through their existing way they participate in society, which is mainly through interest groups, whatever they happen to be interested in, whether it's sports, whether their local community, whether it's their hobbies, their professional associations, and so on. These groups, we could organise that in some sort of umbrella organisation, and that umbrella organisation could then conduct referenda that focused on these contextual issues, and they would get their own people to vote, and they would, if necessary, create any bodies that are required.
But these interest groups and associations, they're a very disparate lot, aren't they? Very different groups and bodies. What do they have in common that would enable the public engagement with this sort of approach that you're suggesting?
Well, the one thing that they all have in common, that all people have in common, but certainly all these groups have in common, is they want to live within a society where there is responsible and intelligent government, where politicians behave in a mature and professional fashion, where life is not disrupted by needless wars, needless stoking of fears, needless economic crises. That's what we all have in common.
Okay. And this umbrella organisation that you mentioned, where you bring these associations together and groups together, can you describe the purpose and operation of that, please?
Well, let me be clear. The first thing is we have to check. We need to create a little small organisation that's funded by some charitable person or organisation to see whether, in fact, civil society's leaders actually feel now is the time that they're ready. But if they do, we could create a national association for proper political participation. Okay, because that's what it's all about, is getting politicians to work properly within the existing system. This association would have a small secretariat that would do its organisation. It would have an annual conference where it would identify and agree suitable referendum items that related to context and standards. These referenda would be held every whatever's decided, once a quarter perhaps, or once every month, or whatever is decided. And the interest groups, the associations, would encourage their members to vote, not indicate how to vote, but just encourage them to express a view. This annual conference with internet and everything, everybody could actually be aware of what was going on and participate. It would be very open, it would be very transparent. So it's a rather simple idea in which the public can express their willingness and their responsibility.
But actually, isn't this all far too complicated. Why not, for example, just use what there is already? There are a number of polls, aren't they, done by organisations like YouGov, ICN Mori. Why not just use them to articulate the public's view about matters?
Well, let's be clear. A poll is not an expression of the public. Right? It is a pollster's attempts to know what the public might be thinking, and the pollster decides what the questions will be. And you cannot compare such a thing. I mean, they typically will look at sample 1,000 people or 2,000 people. You cannot compare this to tens of millions of people expressing their view in a vote. That is a true public expression.
Okay. So moving to the issues then that might be suitable for this sort of referendum process. Can you give us some examples of what they might be?
Well, this is in a sense up to the public, right? So I give you my own views. So that wouldn't want to try impose these. But for example, the government continually deceives the public about its finances. The governments like the EU, America, England, that they don't work to professional accounting rules. They basically, any business that functioned as they did, the directors would be thrown into prison. So my view is that we should have private sector accounting standards. This is a contextual matter. This says nothing about what the borrowing should be, what taxation should be, it is purely a contextual thing which relates to standards and attacks deception and dishonesty. Let's look at the willingness of politicians at the moment to simply tell blatant lies, often not to actually benefit the country, which may occasionally be needed, for example, in foreign policy, right? But they tell lies to get votes, or they tell lies to avoid embarrassment. This is not does not contribute to a healthy society. Why couldn't we have a political standards authority where such occasions could be referred, and it could be expected that a politician has to appear on primetime television or in the main papers with an express apology, starting off with "I lied when I said," not some euphemism, "I misspoke" or "I misunderstood," but actually I told a falsehood or something. Anyway, it could be organized. This could be organised. I think that it only would have to happen a few times, and we would have a raising of political discourse in this country. Following 2001, a whole raft of laws were passed in most Western countries that effectively give totalitarian control to ministers. They just have to say they need it. Is this the sort of society we want to live in? Could we not say that all those laws need to be repealed? This seems again to be it's a contextual issue. It's a sort of society we want to live in. Now, I'm not predicting what the response will be. It could be that the majority of people do want totalitarian laws in place. But this is the sort of thing people should have the opportunity to vote on.
So, generalising from this then, can you set out the sort of principles that might shape solutions to some of the abuses that you've mentioned today?
Well, I'm repeating. The first number one thing is we focus on context. I mean, just give you another example. You would never want a doctor to give medicines that he didn't understand. You wouldn't want a lawyer to defend you without knowing what the law is. But many politicians pass things into law. They don't actually know what laws they've passed. Now, the point is we have to get small gains in these areas. We need to get small gains in relationship to reducing deception, reducing unprofessionalism, reducing theft. The second principle is we really have to ensure the public is the judge of whether or not abuse has occurred. We cannot depend on self-regulation. It doesn't work anywhere else, and it's certainly not going to work with politicians. The third thing is we have to get individual accountability. We have to ensure that offenders pay some sort of price. We can't have situations where people do shocking things and the result is they have to leave politics, they get ennobled, go to the Lords, get a pension far beyond any of us could even dream of, and that's their reward for having actually done something that's unsatisfactory. Finally, we do have to appreciate that politicians have a tough job. Right? They're exposed to terrible temptations in regard to the access to power and money, and we have to have compassion for them. I think that politicians' human rights must be protected in this process.
Do you think new laws will be required?
I'd personally be against new laws because once you talk about laws, you're involving the politicians. The whole point is that laws to control behaviour are never very satisfactory. What we need is public involvement and public vigilance that will lead to new norms such that behaviour that was perfectly acceptable today becomes unacceptable.
Well, in reality, won't the government just say that this style of referenda process is simply not British? Or indeed, they might even go further and say, well, actually, it's illegal.
Well, you could say it's extra legal, but then society functions in an extra legal way. Human beings have to be able to function just in freedom. Laws are only there to stop you doing something that's harmful. It can't be illegal for people to express their views, and particularly if we do this via the internet, it's certainly much less disruptive than street protests and so on. So, of course, like any profession, they're going to resist control. There's going to be they're going to dislike it and distrust it. But the public, if the public do this, then it will become the British way. Right? I mean, it was the British way to have divine right of kings. And then we moved to having parliamentary sovereignty. That became the British way. We could move to genuine sovereignty of the people. Why shouldn't that become the British way? Let's be clear, we're not talking about a referenda to decide complex political issues. We're talking about referenda about basic professional standards.
Yes. Just pressing this a bit further, but if you have a government that's properly elected with a working majority in Parliament, why should they take any notice of any of these messages that are coming from this referenda process?
Why should they ignore the views of tens of millions of voters? Is that the question?
Yes.
Politicians tend not to ignore the views of tens of millions of voters when they're unambiguously expressed. If you have a look at the situation, politicians currently hate referenda because the current professionalism is a paternalistic one in which the politicians know better than the people. We've seen that with the EU a great deal. The EU tries to block referenda. If the people say something that the political classes don't like, they regard it as the wrong result. They have more referenda till they get the result they want. This is exactly the opposite sort of society that I believe a mature public wants.
Yes, and on that last point about mature public, isn't the truth of this that in fact the public will, what they'll clamour for, what they really want is resolution to issues. They're not going to be concerned with an apparatus like this to affect the context. They're really going to want politicians to get things sorted out.
Well, the point about sorting out and political issues is that this divides people, because it's never obvious exactly what the correct choice is. And I personally believe that one of the implications of this approach is that we will get wider participation of the public in political issues. But that's another topic. We need to have another interview to explore that. The issue here is much simpler. Are people now ready to be responsible for their politicians and the way they go about their work in terms of basic standards? If people are not ready, then we will continue to have unprofessional behaviour, we'll continue to have deception and manipulation, we'll have even more oppression, and the more money will be transferred from the poor and middle classes to the pockets of the political and financial elites. That's what faces us all.
Dr. Kinston, thank you very much for that.
Pleasure.